Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with the next chapter of A London Book Window by James Milne, and today's chapter is titled Old Wine in New Bottles. And we're getting quite close to the halfway point of the book here. So, old wine in new bottles. If you know London well, you know Clifford's Inn, which lies between Fetter Lane and Chancery Lane, nearby the Old Temple Bar. It cannot, having regard to this, be said to be sequestered, but when you get within its gates, you do find an air of quiet. Partly that comes from the aspect of age, in the buildings and the worn trees which survive with them, because the roar of traffic along Fleet Street and the Strand is near and loud. Partly it comes from the associations of the place, because somehow a home of law creates an atmosphere of settledness, of things ordered and only to be done, and Clifford's Inn is in the records with Lincoln's Inn and Gray's Inn and the Temple, though as one might say has long ceased to practice. Years ago, on a fine summer morning, I went to Clifford's Inn seeking for somebody called Samuel Butler, who had written a new book which excited curiosity. He had written other books earlier, but they had not all been much read, and so he was rather an unknown figure. He turned out to be in no want of advertisement for himself or his books, and really he never got it until he died. Then there came along quite a boom in Irwin and its companion works, and as that boom has consolidated itself into a definite vogue, Samuel Butler is very well known today. To me, anyhow, possibly because I talked with him in the flesh, he is a distinctive sign of the great business there has been, since the war, in old literature and new editions, a variation of the scriptural phrase about new wine in old bottles. Nobody who pretends to be a serious reader should be outside this renaissance and persistence of authors who either belong to our time or to our generation. They are authors on the way to a permanent place in English literature, for a deal of testing is made of them by time and the public judgment before they are awarded an eternal laurel wreath. Samuel Butler's expression was one of amusement that anybody should be interested in him or what he did. He had made some money out of sheep in New Zealand, being a good farmer and looking like one. But he couldn't make authorship pay, not he. His Irwin, a fantasy of philosophy laid in a land of nowhere, was refused by George Meredith in his capacity as a reader to a London publishing house. Well, there are many publishing houses which would like to have Irwin now, and the notebooks, and the other writings of this Butler, so different a man from Bishop Butler. They told me, he said about his rejected Irwin and Meredith. He reported it was a philosophical work, little likely to be popular with a large circle of readers. I hope that if I had been their reader, and the book had been submitted to myself, I should have advised them to the same effect. Probably, and so probably would anybody, but the unexpected happens with books as in life, and Irwin, when it appeared in 1872, was a sound success. It was something new, something strange, and so, if you want reading out of the ordinary, borrow it from the nearest library. Among Butler's books, it, at least, meets a test which he applied generally to authors. If, he declared, a writer, a painter, or a musician makes me feel that he held these things to be lovable, which I myself hold to be lovable, I am satisfied. Art is only interesting in so far as it reveals the personality of the artist. Surely that is the proof of all writing, as far certainly as the mass of people are concerned, that in it, as a medium of communication, we meet someone or some characters whom, if we could, we would like to meet personally. It will have occurred to you that when you sit down by the fire on an evening, with a favorite book in your hand, you are really sitting hand in hand with a beloved friend. It is always the human touch, however it may be expressed in language, which grips us, because it is life speaking to life. Another characteristic Englishman, W.H. Hudson, resembled Samuel Butler in the one thing that to him also high fame came late. But it did come in time for him to know it, and indeed when in his later years his writings began to bring in enough for a simple sustenance, he gave up a modest civil list pension, which he had enjoyed. A man who did that must, the veriest stranger to him would reason, be worth reading, for it is hard, human nature being what it is, to put away something useful which we have only to let alone and it will stay with us. Hudson was a modest, gentle, retiring gentleman who loved nature in all her moods and knew most of them. He communed with her and with himself in South America, in England, and elsewhere, and out of this communing sprang his books, of all of which there are now reasonably priced editions. No, not all, for he wrote a novel under another name, and its rarity may be gathered from the fact that a copy of the first edition has fetched £71 in a London sale room. It was a specially interesting first edition, because it had been Hudson's own, presented to him by H.H. He was Henry Hartford, the pen name used for the novel by its writer. The story was called Fan. A young girl was the heroine of it, and it appeared in print in 1892. Maybe, although one does not know, it may have been published on commission, as the term is, and the terms are when the writer of a book is himself responsible for the venture. Anyhow, the edition was a small one of only 350 copies, which fact makes a surviving one, if you can lay hands on it, anywhere, all the more valuable. We owe a tremendous debt to Englishmen who have gone forth into the world and done things before sitting down to write. One does not mean mere chronicles of an individual journey or a special enterprise. One means men who found the mine of genuine authorship and literature in their own experiences, men like Hudson and Joseph Conrad. Ah, you will explain, or exclaim. I think it's supposed to be exclaim, but the word explain is here. I don't know why we as the reader would be explaining something, so I'm going to go with exclaim. Ah, you will exclaim, but Conrad was born a Pole. True, but that makes no difference to the argument, and indeed it might be said to strengthen it, because a line of literature which gathers to itself a talent like Conrad's must be fine metal in our English pasture. What must he, routing his very English farm near Canterbury in Kent, have thought about the sale for over £1,000 of the manuscript of his early story, Elmer's Folly? It would have recalled to him his experiences with the publishers until it became dog-eared and worn-looking. Possibly he grew a little despondent about finding an Appian way in literature. But unconsciously, while he sailed the seas as an officer of our mercantile marine, he stored his mind with the rough treasure stuff, which later he was to mint into novels already classed A1. Old wine in new bottles, it has in a literary way been flowing freely, and if it has found its way to the hearts of a fresh generation of readers, so much the better. There's been a great to-do about Herman Melville, the American writer whom a year or so ago a few English critics thought they had discovered for England. Nothing of the sort. His Typee and his Omo of the Southern Seas are as intimate to some of us as the memories of our childhood. It was his whaling story and autobiography, Moby Dick, that caused the belated shouting, but it also was familiar to English readers and perhaps less good than Typee. Some day, some confident literary fellow will happen on Dana's 2 years before the mast, and he will exclaim, "Here's the finest sea book ever written." He will not be far wrong, because that has been understood for half a century. Even so, the clever itch of not very widely read critics is good, and that it directs others to treasure pages lying in wait for them. Nobody can have failed to read Robinson Crusoe, but there are other books by Defoe worthy of consultation, and the current reprinting of these, although in limited editions, has been so much literary service to the community. A much nearer person, Anthony Trollope, has come along again with his Barchester novels of a Victorian England which has almost passed away. He has been made welcome a little out of curiosity about himself, for he could write at the rate of 1,000 words an hour, and he made nearly £70,000, and also a little out of curiosity about the England which he describes. Anthony had no genius, and perhaps prided himself in the fact that he took uncommon trouble to build stories of plot and characters, and he is worth looking up in the new editions of him. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with his summation here that Anthony Trollope had no genius. I think it took quite a bit of genius and skill to craft his novels in the way that he did, because he certainly made the scenes and the characters and the plot seem so real, even if he was, as Milne says here, very focused on plot and on characters. But that was his writing style, and I don't think it's fair to say that he lacked genius. Anyway, moving on. George Borrow, who we have always with us, may be, to some people, for that wonderfully described fight with the tinker in Lavengro. Ever so many quiet folk are pugilistic enough to come to read about a round, so long as nobody comes to any great harm. Trying to understand this sentence. As I've said before, James Milne does not have the easiest writing style to read. His sentences are very long, he peppers them with commas, and sometimes I'm not sure which end of the sentence is up. Ever so many quiet folk are pugilistic enough to like to read about around, so long as nobody comes to any great harm. I am not sure what he means. Read about around. Is he perhaps talking about a round of drinks, a round in a fight? I don't know. We'll leave it at there and move on. Borrow may be said to have carried the Bible in one hand. Think of his Bible in Spain and vagabondage in the other. And the two missions kept his memory green. Another old favorite in constant new clothes is Jane Austen, whose reticence of style often hides much good thought. Even Mrs. Montagu, the Queen of the Blue Stockings, has been looking up, and a very different, much more romantic and more recent writer, Robert Louis Stevenson, is blowing in new collected editions. They follow the Vilma and the Pentland, the Swanston and the Edinburgh editions of his writings, and all of them go up in value with the keeping like good wine in good bottles. So clearly they pay the buyer a double debt, like the bedstead in Goldsmith's deserted village. Finally, if you visit a sufficient bookshop, you will find on its counters that John Morley and Thomas Hardy are like old wine and new bottle men, meaning that they are in recent collected editions. Between Morley as an essayist and Hardy as a novelist, you are sure of as good writing as has been done in English, within memory, and with a comforting knowledge like that, one can fitly bring to a close this calling back of a book world of yesterday. So old wine in new bottles, what we would today call classic authors that have stood the test of time, who are continuously printed in new editions for new readers, which is certainly something that happens today. And many of the authors mentioned in this chapter are today still being printed in new editions. And so that is Old Wine in New Bottles. The next chapter will be titled About Publishers' Readers.